להשקיע. כן, אוקיי, בסדר, אנחנו יכולים להתחיל.
Okay, all right, so shalom everybody. I'm used to meet y'all in Nitzanim. I recognize here some of the faces that I missed. Yes, and I'm happy to give now the class. So let's start. So as y'all know, today is the 2nd of July. It was said when there were coalition treatments, the Heskem Koalitioni, it was said that all the issue of the Ribonut, the annexation of parts of Judea and Samaria, that will be not earlier than the 1st of July. And all the journalists and everyone were waiting to see what will happen in the 1st of July. So all of us know that currently wasn't anything, but you know, from the surroundings of Netanyahu, it is said to be something. And okay, so here.
I have an early sheet, so I'm waiting for him to get up. He's just getting up now.
1 second. Excuse me all. Yeah. So I just want to apologize. I did something very not democratic now. I muted all so that we won't have disturbances. So I muted all, but I want to clarify. Each and every single one of you is able to unmute himself or herself and ask a question or make a comment. So please do so, okay? Currently, you're all muted. That's just for the convenience that there won't be background disturbances, but it's very easily, anyone who wants to make a comment or ask a question, just unmute yourself and speak up. So now I'm going back to the background of our shir. Now it's the 2nd of July, and there were a lot of discussions about annexing, announcing sovereignty, declaring sovereignty on Israeli sovereignty on parts of Judea and Samaria. Okay, so now the question is, of course, what is the Jewish perspective on this? And I want to clarify my question. Politically, I'm not going to tell you my political opinions, even though I have political opinions regarding the matter. But, you know, I'm a rabbi here, and, you know, different people have different opinions regarding the matter in terms of practicality, what's pragmatically is right to do. Some right-wingers think it's a good thing to announce sovereignty on parts of Judea and Samaria. Some right-wingers think it's wrong from all kinds of directions. I'm not only talking about Moetzet Yesha. Some left-wingers, surprisingly, I heard there's a left-winger that was for it. There were many left-wingers that are against it. So there are all kinds of cheshbonos. What's wrong with the current situation that we're building there without, and now it will just create tension? Or on the other hand, there's a lot of significance. All kinds of political opinions and realistic assessments about potential outcomes of the. And all of this is extremely interesting, but that's not what I'm going to talk today about. Okay, I'm gonna talk about a preliminary question, meaning what is the from a Torah perspective? Is there any value? Is there any religious, Jewish value in Jewish sovereignty over lands of Israel? Some of you might tell me automatically yes, but then I'll ask you, where in the Torah does it say that it's important that there will be Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel? Now, by the way, I'm not talking about Judea and Samaria. I went backward. I went back and I said, you know what? Forget about Judea and Samaria. Is there any value in, you'll call it Malchus Israel? Is there any value in Jewish sovereignty over the land of Israel? And if there is any value, just tell me, where do you see it? Anyone has an idea? Where can I see any source or any discussion or any attitude or someone that comments about, the significance, if there is at all, of Jewish sovereignty over the land of Israel? What is the first thing that comes to your mind? What? Brit Ben Abtarim. Where in Brit Ben Abtarim do you see Hashem promises, let's say in Brit Ben Abtarim, he promises Abraham that after they will be in Egypt, he will take them out Berchush Gadol. Okay, I'll comment from what Marsha is saying in a second, what she wrote in the chat, but just telling us that we're going to go to the land of Israel. You know what? Maybe I should have clarified the question more. Let's say there is a Turkish regime or a British regime. I'm speaking totally theoretical. It never happened here in Israel. A British regime, a British government over the land of Israel. And let's say that this British government gives me total religious freedom. It is known that many Jews are making Aliyah. Many Jews are living in Israel. Only the state is run and the government is foreign. Maybe the UN is running the country. Not a good idea. But let's say there is a British mandate. Okay, I'm speaking. Let's say there is a British mandate, and it gives full religious freedom to the Jews. They allow us to build the temple. We're building the temple on the Temple Mount. But the government, the prime minister, it's just a British colony. Okay? Is there any problem with that from a Jewish perspective? So Marsha wrote in the chat, Marsha wrote King Temple, meaning that she's the fact that there is a paragraph in Deuteronomy, in Parshat Shoftim, in Sefer Dvarim, about appointing a king, that shows that there is a value in Jewish sovereignty. Okay, we'll discuss that. Brit Ben Abtarim was mentioned, but Brit Ben Abtarim only says that we're going to go as people to Israel. It doesn't say who is running the country. You just dwell in the country. And that goes with what Marsha says, it's pikuach nefesh to be in the exile. Okay, let's say I agree. So here the nations allow you to be in Israel, have express religious freedom. You're no more in the exile. Only the sovereignty is not a Jewish sovereignty. Doesn't matter at all. Now people sometimes say, Mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. There is a mitzvah to dwell in the land of Israel. Okay? Mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. I'm speaking here with 29 people, 28 people, because also the Bat Sharut is one of the members here. I see there are 30 participants. I was born in Israel. My parents were born in Israel. I don't know about the Bat Sharut that is here, but at least 28 people here, I believe, are people that made Aliyah, and I admire them. Now, I admire all of you. I didn't make Aliyah. I just didn't have the opportunity because my parents were born here, and I was born here. But Tachlis, I'm admiring you. For me, it was easy. I was born here. And people who did Aliyah, so okay, they came to Eretz Yisrael, and now they dwell in Eretz Yisrael. They're performing Mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, but that still doesn't prove the fact that there is a mitzvah to dwell in the land of Israel, and that a place of a Jew is to live in the Holy Land. That doesn't say anything about the sovereignty. Not necessarily, at least. Okay? And indeed, you see that in radical Haredi circles, they're saying definitely a sovereignty of a secular Jewish state. It's just like having a Turkish regime or a British regime. It has no more significance than that. And okay, maybe an ideal regime they do admire, like a religious government, Jewish religious government, but some of them might even tell you, no, the whole point is Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, to dwell on the land of Israel. The sovereignty, who cares? Where is it written that it's important? Marsha mentioned the king. Well, you know, the paragraph of the king is a little controversial. It's true that the Rambam understood there is a mitzvah to appoint a king. But who said that everyone agrees with him? Okay, the commandment to conquer Israel. Okay, we'll mention that, and we'll see whether that implies a value of Jewish sovereignty. And at any rate, so A, not everyone agrees that there's a commandment to appoint a king. And B, even ones who agree, so they're talking again about an ideal, l'chora, about an ideal Jewish regime. What does it have to do with the current state of Israel? Now, if the current state of Israel doesn't fall under that basket because it's a secular regime and it's not a king or this or that and or that, then since there's no value in Jewish sovereignty, I mean religious value, there might be strategic value, but no religious value in Jewish sovereignty, even on Tel Aviv, then on the same token, there's no value in Jewish sovereignty, announcing Jewish sovereignty, no Jewish value in Judea and Samaria. That's what my claim might be a claim. And I of course, I'm gonna make laws in land to protect the Jews in it. Okay, so I have a great Chasidei Umot HaOlam, the British mandate. They're great people, and they'll do every law they're committed to protect the Jews. At any rate, when if I'm as Rabbi Burl Wine pointed out, and I was mechaven to his opinion, I'll show it soon later in the shir, maybe if there'll be time. His comment on this, that there is an interesting coalition between extreme Haredi circles and the extreme left-wing liberal circles, secular ones. Some of you might have heard of the Jewish philosopher thinker called George Steiner. George Steiner, and you know what? He didn't invent it. Let's think about Hermann Cohen. Hermann Cohen was a German philosopher at the end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century, a student of Kant. Hermann Cohen was a Reformed Jew, and he was anti-Zionist in ideology because he said that the Jewish nation is a chosen nation, and the mission of the Jewish nation is to be a spiritual nation, a nation that spreads spirituality and morality and ethics amongst all the nations. Therefore, exile is not only an accident, a tragedy. Exile is actually a progress. Jews don't need territory. As George Steiner says, what is your dream? To have a Jewish policeman, to have a Jewish soldier that kills people, to have a Jewish ganev, to have this is not what we're aiming to. So here there is an interesting coalition. These circles are strongly believing in Jewish nationality in terms of the Jewish people have a nationality around the Torah. As La'avdil Rav Sadia Gaon says, Einu mateinu uma ela betorotea. Our nation is defined by the Torah. And we're a spiritual nation, therefore territory doesn't define us as a nation. And all of these material aspects are not for us. Army, sovereignty. I want to share with you another thinker, and then we'll go to the sources. As a young man, I read a book in Hebrew. Perhaps it was translated to English. I hope it was, but I'm not sure. There is the famous Israeli writer, Amos Oz. Amos Oz is an extremely famous Israeli writer, passed away not that long ago, was a candidate to get a Nobel Prize many times, a very good writer. Amos Oz has an interesting book that I feel I think it's good that I'll share with you a little introduction about the book. It brings you to Israeli spirit. Amos Oz in the 80s, he wrote a book called Po Vesham Be'eretz Yisrael, Here and There in Eretz Yisrael. This book is not a regular book of Amos Oz. It's not a novel. He came as a half journalist. He spent time in Beit Shemesh in a Beit Cafe and heard the people in Beit Shemesh, their anger, their support of Menachem Begin, their anger on what Mapai, Mifleget Avodah, did to them. And he recorded it and presented it and wrote it in his fashion. There are 2 chapters there about his meeting in Ofra with settlers. Parenthetical remark, Amos Oz is a Meretz supporter. He's left-wing in his opinions. So he spent time with Ofra settlers. He spent time with this group, with that group. And he wrote his book about his travels in Eretz Yisrael, Po Vesham Be'eretz Yisrael. Interesting book. Now, the book starts, and here is my point and the relevance to our class. The book of Po Vesham Be'eretz Yisrael starts with Amos Oz visiting in Jerusalem where he grew up, in the neighborhood where he grew up. Now, guess what? Amos Oz grew up in Geula, Meshar, that area. Once upon a time, when Amos Oz was a kid, that was a very mixed area. It wasn't only a Haredi area like today, okay? And he himself, his house was traditional, not religious. So, and his teacher, by the way, was the poet Zelda. Zelda was his first grade teacher. So Amos Oz writes a book about his travel. The first chapter is starting with his visit in Geula. And of course, he documents the change of the demography in the neighborhood, that it became Haredi already then in the 80s. And then Amos Oz introduces us to a dialogue. And here I want you to listen carefully, because this will be something that we'll focus on this year. Amos Oz is documenting there an interesting dialogue, exchange of words that he had with one of the Haredim there. And the Haredi is telling him the following smart statement. He says, you need to understand, I'll say the sentence in Hebrew and then I'll translate it. Kol inyan ha-medina ze goyim nachas. Okay. He tells him the whole issue, the whole interest of a medina, of a state, is goyim nachas. It's shtusim of goyim. Maybe we need to do it. By the way, this Haredi, he wasn't necessarily in a Turi Karta. It's not that he didn't say that we need a state of Israel. But in terms of value, I'll give you an example. You need a refrigerator in your home, right? All of you. That doesn't give the refrigerator a spiritual value. There's some tools that one needs. So you need sovereignty, but sovereignty is a secular thing. And now it's the fashion of the Goyim in the past 200 years, nationalism, that different nations have sovereignty and independence. It wasn't that all time. And therefore, we should be players in this world. The Haredi acknowledges that. But, well, you guys are Zionists, and he's speaking to a secular Zionist, to Amos Oz. You guys are Zionists, but hey, relax. This whole issue of Medina is a Goyim Nachas. one needs a refrigerator, one needs sovereignty. That's all. Not more and not less. It's a nachas of goyim, and that's all. Now, what's interesting is that like in the middle of the book, many, many chapters later, Amos Oz documents the speech he gave to Ofra settlers in a debate, in a public debate that was there. It was starting with a speech that he gave them as their guest in Motzei Shabbos. Motzei Shabbos, he spent the Shabbos with them in Ofra, and then he gave a speech. And guess what Amos Oz said? Amos Oz said, I don't hold like Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion sanctified the sovereignty, the nationalism, the mamlachtiyut. Ben Gurion sanctified it. Amos Oz told them, I'm not in that school of thought. I hold that Medina is goyim nachas. Anyone who had good memory saw where he took that terminology. He just copy-pasted. It was very smart of Amos Oz. At the first chapter, he put it in the mouth of the Haredi that spoke with him and rebuked him. And then he himself said, you know what? In that sense, I agree with that Haredi. I, Amos Oz. Both of us, I'm secular atheist, he's a Haredi, but we have a common denominator, that we're not sanctifying the Jewish sovereignty over the lands, the territories of Israel. We see it as a tool. It's something needed. It's a refrigerator, not more than that. All right? So I think I clarified what I'm discussing here. And now what I want to do quickly, I understand that we have time till 12. Am I correct? Or what? Till 11:45? Answer, please. To when is this shir going? 11:45. What? Where's the Bat Sharut? She should help me out here. She knows the rules.
11:45.
11:45. Thank you. All right. So let's go. I'm sharing with you a screen. And here, annexation of Judea and Samaria, or announcing sovereignty over parts of Judea and Samaria. Is there any value? Is there any value in Jewish sovereignty? Meaning, my question here is not only regarding Judea and Samaria. The title is just because now it's current events. Rather, it is regarding the entire thing. So we'll start with Ramban. Ramban's famous statement in the Sefer HaMitzvot. Ramban claims that there is a positive commandment to dwell in the land of Israel. As we know, Maimonides held, and that's controversial, Maimonides didn't count the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, of dwelling in the land of Israel. Maimonides didn't count it. I know, I stopped sharing it. I'm saying some introductory, and then we'll go again to the sources itself. There is, as we know, Maimonides in his code book, Sefer HaMitzvot, not code book, in his book of mitzvot, the book that he counted the 613 mitzvot, Maimonides did not count the mitzvah of dwelling in Eretz Yisrael as a positive commandment. Nachmanides makes a glossary on it, and he says, I disagree. You forgot to count this mitzvah. How come you didn't count this mitzvah? Some Achronim, like Megillah Esther, hold that really Maimonides holds that nowadays there is no positive commandment to dwell in the land of Israel. However, most commentaries of the Rambam disagree with this and hold that the Rambam, of course, agrees that the mitzvah to dwell in Eretz Yisrael is valid even nowadays. Only for technical reason, it's not counted as one of the 613, either as Rav Kook claims because it's a general mitzvah, he sees it as a general mitzvah that you don't count, or other opinions say that it's included in some other mitzvot that he counted. This way or that way, Nachmanides definitely counts it as a mitzvah. But again, l'chora, this commandment that the Ramban counts as a positive mitzvah, this commandment has nothing to do with our topic. Because the fact that there is a commandment on individuals or even on public people, on a group of people, to live somewhere doesn't mean yet that there's any Jewish value in the government, in the Jewish sovereignty. So let's see how Ramban defines the commandment to dwell in the land of Israel. And you'll see there some of the comments that you all wrote in the chat. So I'm sharing the sheet again. Look, Ramban, I'm reading to you together. It's in Hebrew and I'll translate to English. That we were commanded to inherit the land that God, blessed He, gave to our patriarchs, to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And we will not leave it by any other of the others of the nations, or to be shmama, to be empty. The thing is this, as you could see, this commandment is not only that he's telling you, the commandment is to inherit the land, lareshet, lehorish, so it's, as people said here, to conquer. Furthermore, the statement is not to leave it by any other nation. So he's clearly talking about nations here. And when he commands the Jewish people, when the Torah, according to Ramban, commands the Jewish people not to leave it by any other nation, the simple wording, I know it's not an absolute proof, but the simple flow of the wordings of Ramban is that it's talking about sovereignty, not only about simply living there. Because it says, don't leave it, inherit it, and don't leave it by any other nations. Who doesn't leave a land by any other nations? A nation, that is us. Let's continue. V'hu amru lahem, and what is the pasuk that is the source for this positive commandment of inheriting the land and not letting any other nation to be there? V'hoashtem et haaretz v'yishavtem ba. You should inherit the land and dwell there. Because I, Hashem, gave you this land to inherit it. And you should live in that, itnachaltem, settle in this, and you should settle the land. And now look at how Ramban continues. And this is what the sages are calling milchemet mitzvah. Clearly, he speaks about war. There is a positive commandment to do a mitzvah to inherit the land. Now, who does wars? Individuals does wars? Do wars? No. Individuals don't do wars. The ones who do wars are nations. So it's definitely a commandment over the nation is commandment, and the nation is commanded to inherit the land, i.e. to make a government there, rule it. And he continues, and I'm saying that this is the mitzvah that the sages are speaking so much about it, so highly about it. And this is to have a dira, to dwell in Israel, to live there. And they said that anyone who leaves the land of Israel is considered an idol worshiper. So here he switched to the individual. He says, all of this is part of this positive commandment that we were commanded to dwell and settle there, to inherit and sit there. Therefore, he concludes, it's a positive commandment for generation. Every individual is commanded by it, and even at the time of exile. So look at what he's saying. Maimonides says the following, when he is arguing with Maimonides, so of course they're arguing about the individual, because both Maimonides and Maimonides lived at the time of exile, and without any Jewish sovereignty in Israel. But Maimonides wanted to say, don't tell me that Maimonides didn't count the mitzvah, because Maimonides thought that the commandment is only to the Jewish nation to inherit the land. Don't tell me that, because I think that part of the details of that commandment of inheriting and making a war to conquer it, part of the details of that mitzvah is also commandment of every individual to have a place in Israel and live there. So the original commandment, according to Maimonides, of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, is actually a national commandment to have a Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. That what seems to be the simple wording. So, Avi Kanai, you said in the beginning of the class, there is a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, but you can't prove from here that there is a value in Jewish sovereignty. Well, no, at least the simple reading of Maimonides, I know one can argue a little bit. We'll see later people saying it even more clearly, is that part of the commandment to dwell in Eretz Yisrael, not only part, even the original commandment, the basic commandment, is on the nation as a nation, not to leave the land to any other nation, but that the nation as a nation will be there. So even if that doesn't correspond necessarily directly to the concept of modern national sovereignty, but it's still some sense of national dwelling and not letting any other nation as a nation to dwell. Well, plus minus that means some government and Jewish government and sovereignty in the land of Israel. That's at least the simple understanding. So first answer is the value of Jewish sovereignty is part, and maybe even the original part of Mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Now we have a comment of a very smart rabbi, religious Zionist, called Rabbi Yehuda Brandes. See, Rabbi Yehuda Brandes, here I'm marking it. Rabbi Dr. Yehuda Brandes is the dean of, and the head, is the head of the Herzog College that is right by the Gush Yeshiva. A big Talmud Chacham, also has a PhD in Talmud. And he wrote many, many years ago an article in Tchumen, and he wrote something that I think as a fact is true. He speaks about the medieval Rishonim, the thinkers, our medieval rabbis, Ramban, Rashba, Rabbi Yehuda Levi, all these, and he says, when they related to the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, the Rishonim did not attribute significance to the question of sovereignty over the land at all. Meaning it is true that the issue of sovereignty over the land was not an issue that was emphasized and discussed by, and they didn't attribute significance to it. The main discussion was about living in Israel, and having a sovereignty over the land of Israel is not something that took an importance in the medieval thinkers. However, later on, we see some explicit comments regarding it. Let's look at what Reb Tzadok HaKohen Melublin, a Hasidic writer, Reb Tzadok HaKohen Melublin, writes about the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael with a direct relationship to the issue of sovereignty. He says, dwelling, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, dwelling is defined only as a peaceful dwelling. And what does it mean, peaceful dwelling? That you are the master of the land. When you're commanded to dwell in the land of Israel, the ideal dwelling is that you're dwelling there as a government, peacefully. This is what's called dwelling. And that means when the Beit HaMikdash is built. And when the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, even though not all of them were expelled from the land, there wasn't full exile. So there was a period of time that the Mikdash was destroyed, but still there was dwelling of people, of Jewish people in the land of Israel. Even those Jews that were dwelling there are not really called Yoshvei Haaretz, dwellers of the land. And they're not really considered dwelling there because they're slaves to the people. They're slaves. They're subordinate. They're under the leadership. They're submissive. They're subordinate to the kings of the Gentile nations that are governing, that are ruling there, just like us in Chutz La'aretz. This is not considered dwelling. This is just being a ger, a visitor in the land, and you're not mekayim v'shaftem. What Reb Tzadok here explains he says, okay, you were commanded to dwell, lashevet, to dwell, to reside in the land of Israel, to be a resident in the land of Israel. But if you're not, if there's no Jewish sovereignty, there's no Jewish government there, rather there is a British mandate there, even if this British mandate is extremely generous and gives you full religious rights and everything, you're not really dwelling in the land in its full meaning. Because when I'm dwelling in the land, that means that I'm sitting there as a balabait. As a balabait. That is really what's considered that you have, that you're now Mekayim Mitzvah Yeshuv Eretz Yisrael. Full fulfillment, the complete fulfillment of Mitzvah Yeshuv Eretz Yisrael, the commandment to be Meyashav Eretz Yisrael, is that you are, not only that you physically now, your foot is on the land of Israel, on the soil, is that you are a balabait. Regarding the king, I will comment to it later, so please bear with me. I'm now trying to make an argument not about the king, okay? The comments about the king are extremely relevant, and I will relate to them. But now I'm making the case for religious value and Jewish sovereignty, even without addressing the question of the king, okay? Just, you're commanded to dwell in the land of Israel. Reb Tzadok says, what is the meaning, the ideal, the Hidur mitzvah, meaning of dwelling? That you're a balabait. That makes sense. Now, let's continue. Pretty much, slightly different, but pretty much in the same direction. The Yeshuat Malko, one of the Achronim in the 20th century, the Yeshuat Malko writes the following. Indeed, also according to Maimonides, that considered the mitzvah of dwelling in the land as a positive commandment, Mikol Makom, he agrees with Maimonides, that's what he says, that the main core, the ideal way, the ikar of the mitzvah is really, as Ramban, and by the way, he's right, we saw it in Nachmanides, we saw it in his wordings, that the commandment is really Yerusha Shiva, inheriting it, conquering it, and dwelling there. And look at his very nice terminology. I said a balabait. Look at what he says. Ke'adam ha'oseh betoch shelo, like someone who does in what he himself owns. So therefore, you need to conquer the land of Israel that will be under our inheritance. Not like nowadays, he spoke before the foundation of the land of Israel. Not like nowadays that we're coming with empty hands, meaning, and even though even now it's obviously a big mitzvah, and there's no doubt that it's a big mitzvah because the fact that we're gathering in the land of Israel is Atchalta de Geula, is the beginning of the Geula, but still, the Ikar mitzvah, as Nachmanides says, and he's basing himself on Nachmanides, he just explains it, very similarly to the Reb Tzadok HaKohen Melublin. Yeshiva, dwelling, the full meaning of dwelling somewhere, is that you are there as an owner, like a person who does in his own thing, in his own stuff. So therefore, the commandment to dwell in the land of Israel already includes in it Jewish sovereignty, according to this approach. Let's see what Rabbi Zevin, the giant, the one who wrote Moadim Ba'alacha, the editor of the Talmudic Encyclopedia, that was at the time of founding the land of Israel, a tremendous Talmud Chacham. Let's see what Rav Zevin quoted in Tchumen Yud says. The foundation of the state, the establishment of the state of Israel, gives special value to the mitzvah of Yeshuv Eretz Yisrael, to all the territories that are in the domains that are under the sovereignty of the state. Nachmanides, that counts the dwelling in the land of Israel as part of the Taryag, is including it inside the commandment 2 of inheriting and conquering, and milchemet mitzvah. So how will I define this inheriting and conquering when I'm in exile? So he says, the Marcheshet says that the mitzvah is fulfilled when you are acquiring the land of Israel, when you are purchasing, meaning even before there was the state of Israel, a Jew that not only dwelled in the land of Israel, but actually bought here territory, that's a kind of already an owner, like a person who does at his own thing. Therefore, he says, the climax, the top, the peak of this mitzvah is fulfilled in its full completeness, in its full heater. You can't reach in all the time of the exile till now when we founded the state, both in quality, that now we have full ownership and full releasing of it, and also in terms of quantity, because we have here much more territories that are released. And needless to say that all these that are assisting to establish the state of Israel and to found it are partners in the fulfilling of that mitzvah that is so significant that it stands like it is parallel to all the mitzvahs of the Torah. I think Rav Zevin coined it so clearly. As you know, Rav Zevin, you should appreciate the Hebrew, those who know to read Hebrew, who are good with reading Hebrew. Rav Zevin is the master of expressing complex ideas in clarity and simple words. That's his skill. So Rav Zevin said it so nicely. The minimum as a Jew that makes Aliyah, even at the time of exile, even at the 1800s, of 1700s, if he was able to do so, maybe he doesn't have money to buy a place in Israel, but he comes and just lives here. That's already one step. A higher level of fulfilling the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. And why is that? Because the original mitzvah is to inherit the land. And dwelling, the most full accomplishment of dwelling is that you're a Baal Habayit, as if you're doing in your own thing. Therefore, the next step is if a Jew, even though there's no sovereignty here, there's a British mandate, but a Jew acquires, purchases a place in Israel and lives there as a private Baal Habayit at a certain home. That's already a bigger level of fulfilling dwelling, because he's already somewhat oseh b'toch shelo. But a qualitative jump in the fulfillment of the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, says Rav Zevin, is when you have a Jewish state. All the territories that are under their Jewish sovereignty, there is now a national ownership over them. It doesn't matter that here and there maybe an Arab or any other Gentile, or I don't know, has a private property in Israel. That's great, but still there is a concept of the state of Israel has ownership as the sovereign, as the government over the entire territories that are under Israeli law. So that is the biggest fulfillment of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, the Horashtem Ota, inheriting it, not leaving it to be governed by any other nation, like a person who does at his own thing. So clearly here, Rav Zevin establishes, and that's only an interpretation of Maimonides. Yeah, it's just a natural interpretation of Maimonides, that the fullest dwelling is as one who does on his own thing, and therefore Jewish sovereignty has a value. If we'll go to our concrete, actual question, announcing sovereignty over parts of Judea and Samaria, I can't say that there is an obligation to do that. Of course, a prime minister has a legitimacy, in my humble eyes, halachically, to have all kinds of cheshbonos, pikuach nefesh, all this. But is there a Jewish value to do it? Of course there is, according to this Rav Zevin. The more lands are under Jewish sovereignty, the more lands are now released, and now it's considered the full accomplishment of the commandment of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Let's continue. The Tzitz Eliezer here. I don't want to read it now for the lack of time. No, you know what? We'll read it. I can't resist. The fact that there is an obligation to make Aliyah and to settle the land when the land was established, I want to say my main point here, he says, to prove, according to Halacha, that the obligation to make Aliyah and to dwell it didn't become less once the land was established and once we achieved sovereignty. On the contrary, it became even bigger. I want to explain the background to his tshuva. There were some wise guys that claimed to Tzitz Eliezer that after the Jewish state was established, there's no more commandment to make Aliyah. The Tzitz Eliezer heard from some Jews abroad that, okay, if the Jewish people established Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, then we fulfilled the commandment in the Torah of inheriting the land as a nation. And the fact that some individuals still choose to live abroad, that's not a problem at all. And they don't even have an obligation to come because the state is already established. So he says, I disagree with this. Not only that the commandment to make Aliyah didn't disappear after the founding of the Jewish state. On the contrary, it became even more significant. Why? He says, it is even more valuable. And why is that? Because he says, it's wrong to think that the main commandment was before founding the land in order to found it. He says, because we'll prove that the mitzvah of Aliyah is an independent one. And here he summarizes. The mitzvah of Aliyah and dwelling in the land is separated to two. There is a general commandment on Am Yisrael to dwell in the land, to be a tzibur here. And there is a private commandment on every individual to come to do Aliyah. Now he says it's even a double commandment after the state was the individual one, because the general commandment is now when he is now making Aliyah, he's actually fulfilling two things in one. A, he is fulfilling his private obligation, and also privately he should be part of when he dwells in the land, he is every Jew that comes here makes our sovereignty even stronger. The more Jews that are here, the more our national holding in the land is stronger. And he also assists in that. And therefore, definitely he should come. Now, I am skipping for a second a page, and let's go to the other direction. One direction that we spoke about was the Jewish value, the religious value and Jewish sovereignty over territories of the land of Israel, over areas of the land of Israel, is just to fulfill the commandment of inheriting the land, of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, dwelling in the land, because the ideal, the fullest, the most mehudar meaning of dwelling is as an owner. Now we'll go to the other direction that Marsha and others mentioned already in the beginning. And the last one who wrote a chat also mentioned it. The Gemara in Sanhedrin says the following. Rabbi Yehuda says, there are 3 commandments that the Jewish people were commanded when they were upon entering the land. 3 commandments, Rabbi Yehuda says in the Gemara, were the Jewish people were commanded at the time they were entering the land. One is to establish to them a king, to appoint a king. Second is to destroy Amalek. Third is to build the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. Rabbi Nehorai a Tana. Rabbi Yehuda is a Tana. He says this. Rabbi Norai disagrees. This parsha of the king was said only because they were complaining and asking to have a king. As it says, Ve'amarta asima alai melech. As we know, the terminology in Parshat Shoftim, in the paragraph that commands us to appoint a king, is a little is ambiguous. Can give a double impression. On the one hand, it doesn't say there, you are commanded to appoint a king. It says, when you will come to the land, when you will come to the land, and you will, when you will come to the land, and you will ask, I wish to have a king like all the nations around me, then you should appoint upon yourself a king. So on the one hand, it is presented as if it's merely a response to a request of the people of Israel. If you will come, it's a stipulation. It's not an absolute commandment. If you will come, and you will be jealous at the other nations that have a king and will say, oh, I want the same fashion, then appoint upon yourself a king. And these are the laws of this king. But on the other hand, the language is som tasim. You should appoint yourself. You should appoint upon yourself a king. So that gave room for ambiguity. And Rabbi Yehuda said, no, it is a positive commandment. And Rabbi Norai says, no, it's not a positive commandment. It's just an option. It's just a heter to appoint a king. That's a machlokes. And this machlokes that is between Tanaim is also between Rishonim. Because Maimonides definitely has an opinion here. Maimonides counts. Hashem commanded us to appoint upon ourselves a king. He should gather our nations and will rule us, as it says, Som Tasim Alecha Melech. He holds with Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. On the same token, Maimonides in Hilchos Melachim, he says, when he describes the days of the Messiah, he says, the reason why, no, you know what? I'll leave this Maimonides because it's my next point. Maimonides holds that there is a positive commandment to appoint a king. Abarbanel, he holds that it's a sin to have a king. Okay? And only, just like Eshet Yafat Torah is not a great thing. It's a goyim nachas, but the Torah gave us a heter. The king is also a goyim nachas. That's what the Torah, by the way, that's how the Torah even coins it. So he says, if you will come to the land and you'll say, I want a king just like all the Gentiles around me. Goyim nachas. So Abarbanel holds that a king is goyim nachas. And Rambam says, no, it's part of the ideal Jewish state. Now, people here said, justified, they said, you know what? You asked whether there's a value in Jewish sovereignty. I'll tell you, if there's a positive commandment, if we rule like the Rambam, that there is a positive commandment to appoint a king, obviously that means that not only there is a mitzvah to just live and breathe air in the land of Israel, but there's also a Jewish value in having a Jewish king that is ruling the land of Israel. Value for Jewish sovereignty. Okay. That is, I hear. But here, one can still argue. Is there a value from this perspective? I'm stressing from this perspective, not what I presented in the first half of this year, that the value of Jewish sovereignty is full dwelling in the land of Israel. But if we're attacking the topic, we're approaching the topic from the perspective of the commandment to appoint a king of Maimonides. Well, here, many Haredim will claim to you, the Jewish state, this current Jewish state, that has nothing to do with a commandment of Maimonides to appoint a king. Maimonides describes this king, his role is to enforce and assist the Jewish people to perform the Torah. We're not talking about that. Furthermore, we're talking about a king. Here it's a democracy. It's not a king. It's not the Jewish king that the Torah is talking about. So this has no relevance to us. So from this perspective, announcing sovereignty over areas in Judea and Samaria by this democratic secular state, from this perspective, it's meaningless. It has nothing to do with the Rambam's commandment to appoint a king, or the opinion in the sages that the Rambam ruled halacha l'maaseh, that there is a commandment to appoint a king. Okay, here we must make a comment. This argument was definitely not accepted by many thinkers and rabbis. Some rabbis, and I personally agree with them, hold that the commandment to appoint a king really includes a commandment to have Jewish sovereignty. Let me explain. Meaning a king is the form that is written in the Torah. Okay? That's the common form that was back then. But actually, any other form of Jewish sovereignty is included in that commandment. I want to say more than that. Rav Kook, I'll explain, the Torah, what is the Torah doing there? The Torah is saying, if you will want a king like you have around you, then I command you to appoint a king, but he will be a holy king, he will have his Sofer Torah in front of his eyes, he will be restrained with power, and all this. So, let me translate that same paragraph to our days. If you come to the Jewish state in 1948, and you say, I want to have a democracy like all civilized nations my time. You should have a democracy, but this democracy will have to be a democracy with a character of this and this and this. And I think that's really what's written in the Torah. But I'll tell you, forget about me. Rav Kook, and it's quoted a lot, Rav Kook is claiming in his tshuvas, in his halachic tshuvas, not in a piece of thinking, of philosophy. Rav Kook claims in one of his halachic responses that the king really gets his power from the nation. The king is appointed by Hashem, but by the nation. The king, and I once gave an entire shir about it when I gave a shir about democracy, the king must have the support of all the tribes that approve whatever it is. So really, Rav Kook says when there is no king, the power of the king returned to the entire nation. The entire nation has a power, and the king is representing it. When there is no king, some of these authorities, some of them return to the nation as a whole. Ha'umah bichlaluta. And therefore, our democracy, our Jewish state, to some meanings have a din, says Rav Kook, of Malchus Yisrael, of the kingdom of Israel. Meaning, if you ask, why should I pay taxes in Israel? What obligates me to pay taxes in Israel? So some answer, Dina de Malchuta Dina. Just like in America, I'm obligated to pay taxes because whatever sovereignty you live in, whatever Malchus you live in, you should follow their laws generally. But another answer will be no, there's a special din here of Malchus Yisrael, because our sovereignty regarding some aspects has a din of Malchus Yisrael. Okay? So, in sum, the answer we're giving now is that there is a religious value in Jewish sovereignty, not only because of our first answer, that that's the fullest and complete and ideal and Yehuda, meaning of dwelling in the land of Israel, but also because there is an independent value of Malchus Yisrael, of having a Malchus Yisrael, okay, a Jewish kingdom, or sovereignty, in the lands of Israel. Now, there can be an argument whether our sovereignty, when it's not religious, whether it still has that value. Here, for that, let's see what the Rambam says. The Rambam says, in Hilchos Malachim, when he describes the days of Messiah, the Rambam says the reason why the Chachamim and the Nevi'im, the rabbis and the prophets, desired the days of the Messiah. They desired the day of the Messiah, not in order to control the entire world. Not in order to control the entire world, and not in order that they will control the Goyim, and not in order to be praised by the Goyim, and not only to have material good, but so that they will have time to learn Torah and its wisdom, and there won't be any foreign ruler that will disturb them from doing that, in order that they will inherit the Olam Haba. Okay. Maimonides, let's go a little bit back. Maimonides claims, as opposed to some other thinkers, that there's no real big difference in nature, in terms of the form of nature, laws of nature, between the days of the Messiah and our days. He says the only difference is Jewish sovereignty. That we're not enslaved, Meshuabadim, that we're not subordinated and enslaved by the other nations. This is what he sees the main difference between the days of the Messiah and the days of and our days. And that is, in his eyes, according to the Maimonidean vision, that is in order to facilitate, by the fact that you're relaxed and you have Jewish sovereignty and independence, then you're free to develop in Torah. Now, what happens about a Jewish sovereignty that is not that from Ben Gurion, Netanyahu, not that from a Jewish sovereignty, a state that is secular? Even forget about the individuals that I mentioned, but the state is not run by Torah law. It's a secular democratic state. By the way, not completely, but that's a different story. So now look at what Rav Amital wrote in an article. Rav Amital, and it's good that we're learning him, because Rav Amital, in a few weeks, it will be 10 years since he passed away. So my Rebbe, Rav Amital, I'm now learning in his memory, almost 10 years after he passed away, my Rosh Yeshiva. Rav Amital writes the following: with all the problems that we have in the state, with all the problems and the challenges that we have in the state, we cannot ignore the miracles, the big miracles that we were zocha to them when we established it. The Rambam, and look at what he says here, the Rambam knew very well the nature of the kings of Hashmonai. He writes, Rambam writes in Perush HaMishnayot, you know that in the days of the Second Temple, things were not totally ideal, as you know. And the kings were not following our Jewish tradition. And they would appoint a king by force, even though they're not allowed to do so. So the Rambam is well aware of the fact that the kings of the house of Hashmonai, some of them were not righteous at all. And yet still, the Rambam writes that the establishment of founding the kingdom of Hashmonaim is one of the main reasons to celebrating Hanukkah. When Rambam explains why are we celebrating Hanukkah in his code book, he is saying the people of the Hashmonai, the big Kohanim, they beat the Greeks and they saved the Jews from them, and then they appointed a king from the Kohanim. V'chazra, here is the important sentence. V'chazra malchut leIsrael for more than 200 years. And because of that, the sages in that generation established the 8 days. What is Rambam saying here? And that's important, and I heard it many, many times from my Rebbe Rav Amital also orally. Hashmonai kings were, some of them were very, very problematic from a religious perspective. And yet still it's called Malchus Yisrael. And Rambam says you celebrate Hanukkah for the reestablishment of Malchus Yisrael. In the Tanakh, we see many kings that weren't the Chazonishnikim, to say the least. And yet still, the prophets rebuked them, but they all acknowledged and recognized them as legitimate and valid kings of Israel and as the kingdom of Israel, or the kingdom of Judah. So therefore, it definitely is, according to this line of thought, considered Malchus Yisrael. Last point in the shir, and very important. I have a friend called, older than me, an alumni of our yeshiva, called Dr. Eli Haddad. Eli Haddad is a doctor for Jewish thought. Teaches in Herzog College and also, I think, a little bit in the Hebrew, I don't know. And he wrote a very, very interesting article. You know what, I'll stop sharing, and if we'll have time, we'll read it inside. He wrote a very, very interesting article in the past Yom Ha'atzmaut, not that long ago, past ER, about, for Yom Ha'atzmaut, about the approaches of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi on the one side, and Maimonides on the other side regarding Yom Ha'atzmaut. And I'll explain. He said his claim is very interesting, simple and interesting. He says, mostly in the religious Zionist schools, I'm speaking here in Israel, and I agree with him about the facts. In the religious Zionist schools, especially Merkaz Harav, Nachmanides has a very, very big place, and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is one of the medieval inspirations for religious Zionism, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. His love to the land of Israel, the fact that at the end he makes Aliyah at the end of the Kuzari book and says that a full life of a Jew is to live in Israel. Maimonides, on the other hand, takes a much minor, in that aspect of inspiration for religious Zionist ideology. And Dr. Haddad says it's partially a mistake. Because Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, there is zero, almost zero, and maybe even absolutely zero, but at least, if I want to be careful, almost zero. In the whole book of the Kuzari, he doesn't address the issue of Jewish sovereignty at all. He speaks about the fact that the land of Israel is the land of prophecy, is the land where there is the full meaning of making the covenant with Hashem and keeping the mitzvah, is where a Jew really should live. He speaks about the mystical value, okay, the religious mystical value of Israel for the Jewish individual and the Jewish people. But there is no, the value is just being in that land. You could be a prophet if you're there. You really make the fullest meaning, your tefillot, the fullest meaning of your religious practices are there. That's Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. The stress is on Eretz Yisrael. However, Maimonides is the thinker that established the value of sovereignty, that explains why sovereignty is so critical and important. And why is that? That is because that has to do with the Maimonidean philosophy. Maimonides thinks that we're social creatures. And in order to shape us, and in order to decrease our inclinations and taivas and all this, and to shape us in the right way, that we'll have the complete midot, so that we will be able to cling to Hashem and have the complete learning of Torah and its wisdom. For that, we need civilization, i.e. a state that is actually conducting the laws of morality and Torah, etc. This is the picture the Rambam saw. Therefore, it was very important for him to have Jewish sovereignty in general, and since our land is Israel, so Jewish sovereignty in Israel. Okay? Now, and as we have seen, he saw it part of the messianic thing, that we will be independent, and by that we will be less disturbed and free to deal with Torah and its wisdom. Furthermore, according to the Rambam is not a Breslover. The Rambam is not a Breslover in that sense. In other senses, yes. But the Rambam says, according to the Rambam, an individual can really cling to Hashem only when he is in the social, part of the social makeup. There's nothing like, full individual clinging to Hashem. The fullest way to cling to Hashem is that when you are shaped by, when you are in a civilization that is shaping you, and then by being part of that public, each individual reaches Hashem. I want to show some quotes and then we'll end. Yeah, I have still a minute, so let's see it. Yehuda says the following. Maimonides made a condition, a precondition regarding the commandment to build the temple. He says, first you need to appoint a king. What does that mean? That when he says, first, before you build up you can't build the temple before you appoint a king, which is a secular function. It means that without a sovereignty, without a strong political sovereignty, there is no really way to really know Hashem. And now Yehuda says, it's very hard to know what will the Rambam say regarding the renewal of the independence of the land of Israel. We released the government of the barbarians over us, and we're no more subordinated and enslaved to foreign kings. However, the laws of the state of Israel are not the laws of the Torah, and its government is not coercing all the people of Israel to follow the ways of Torah. So he says, it's an interesting question. On the one hand, some of the goals, some of the reasons why the Rambam said that it's so important that there will be Jewish sovereignty, some of these things were accomplished. We don't have goyim that disturb us. We have the freedom. And we also, and the barbarians, the corrupt, people, we're a civilized society. But on the other hand, it's not the laws of the Torah. So he says, we will find the answer, and here you see that Yehuda is a student of Rav Amital. We will find a certain answer to that in the Rambam's approach to attitude towards the kingdom of Hashmonai. The Rambam decided to establish the laws, to write the laws of Hallel, all Hallel, and only in Hilchos Chanukah. Chanukahs are the days of the independence of the Malchus of Beit Hashmonai. And these 200 years that the Rambam talks about of independence include also things that were definitely not doing the right in the eyes of Hashem. And now, relevance to our days. Yehuda says, the state of Israel is part of the nations that are civilized and enlightened, and its cultural achievements, its scientific achievements, its technological achievements are praised by all. Startup nation. We saw some expression to that in the way, he writes in ER, how we coped with the corona. And here you see how much the fact that you're a citizen in a specific state, in this state or that, they made a big difference regarding your individual welfare. There is no doubt that there is a lot of benefit, a lot of substantial significance, and a lot of benefit to a person and to a Jew when he's a citizen of the Jewish state in Israel. Therefore, clearly we should make halal with bracha. If the Rambam said regarding Chashmonai, kal v'chomer now. So, to sum it up, we saw two anchors from where to say that there is value in Jewish sovereignty over lands of Israel. One, that's the fullest meaning, the ideal, the Yehuda meaning of Mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Second, there is a value in Jewish sovereignty, and of course it should be in the land of Israel because that's our land, but there is a value in Jewish sovereignty. This enables to, as we said, first of all, that we won't have Gentiles that are disturbing us from doing our practices. And this is the only ideal way, and Bezrat Hashem, our state will progress and be more ethical and more. That's the only way the media, according to the Rambam, when you cling and reach Hashem. And I'll say even more than that, that in some schools, and here I don't have, in some midrashim, the malchuta delatata, the malchus Israel that is under, where like the legion, how will we say the legion? Like the army of Hashem, meaning where continues the representatives of Hashem here in the land, meaning the Jewish state, like Rav Kook, as I told you in previous shiurim. Rav Kook says, Avram Avinu founded the Jewish people in order to represent that there could be a nation that is walking as a nation in the ways of Hashem, in the ethical ways. And this you do with all the goyim nachas, meaning you are expressing that you are a normal, natural nation, okay, that is worshiping Hashem as a nation, and that gives, again, a value to Jewish sovereignty in the Jewish land. Okay, still 4 minutes.
We should call.
Okay, Chaverim, great being with you. Have a wonderful Shabbat, and it was very nice to see the faces that I know and to see the names that I know.